A huge welcome back to our grand lecture today. I hope you have not only enjoyed our science talk, but also had a small break and refreshened your coffee and your snacks. I'm still Pernille Berg from BLOXHUB and welcoming you during our first grand lecture consisting of a science talk and a BLOXHUB debate.
No.
A huge welcome
We
back to our
are
grand lecture
extremely
today. I hope
fortunate
you
to have
not
six
only enjoyed our
amazing
science talk,
people.
but also had a small break and refreshened your coffee and your snacks. I'm still Pernille Berg from BLOXHUB and welcoming you during our first grand lecture consisting of a science talk and a BLOXHUB debate.
No.
A huge welcome back to our grand lecture
extremely
today.
fortunate to have
not only enjoyed our science talk, but also had a small break and refreshened your coffee and your snacks. I'm still Pernille Berg from BLOXHUB and welcoming you during our first grand lecture consisting of a science talk and a BLOXHUB debate. We are extremely fortunate to have not only enjoyed our science talk, but also had a small break and refreshed your coffee and your snacks. I'm still Pernille Berg from BLOXHUB and welcoming you during our first grand lecture consisting of a science talk and a
earlier today that this is going to be a lively debate. And although I have tried to curate and compose a wonderful script, we will be discussing not the why, but the hows and the whats and the maybes and the potentials, the business model, the technology, the human behind. And in the midst of that, this is for the 6 people that have taken time out to debate the journey towards circular economy. And for those of you watching, what you can do is ask as many questions as you feel like in the YouTube chat. Comment. Feel free. And you'll see the panelists raising their hand when they have a comment. And I have the wonderful task of trying to share the time from now till we say adieu equally as humanly possible. So without further ado, a huge welcome to you all. And I will let you introduce yourself. And we will start with the ladies first. So Emma from Arab, would you introduce yourself?
Share the time from now till we say adieu equally as humanly possible. So without further ado, a huge welcome to you all, and I will let you introduce yourself, and we will start with the ladies first. So Emma from Arab, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. Are you able to hear me okay? We're having a few technical hearing problems, but I'm assuming you can still hear. Okay, so yeah, hi, Emma Gaines from Arup. So I have a background in environmental science. And I'm currently the Sustainable Development Lead for Arup in our Scandinavia region. So a lot of my work has been involved in circular economy and exploring sustainability from a built environment perspective, which is something that we do a lot of across Arup. But we are a firm of plus 14,000 engineers, consultants, economics, and yeah, so we're a global organization. And I'm really excited today to be a part of this and look forward to the discussions. Sustainability from a built environment perspective, which is something that we do a lot of across Arup, but we are a firm of plus 14,000 engineers, consultants, economics. Yeah, so we're
Thank you very much, Emma. And I will pass the introduction words to Josine. Would you like to introduce yourself?
The introduction words to Josine. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Josine. I'm head of EMEA at GRESB. And GRESB is a sustainability benchmark bringing together sustainability data of over 5 trillion of built assets. So it's a massive coming together of sustainability data which is brought together by the managers, is put in by the manager and passed on to institutional investors to allow them to better allocate capital, taking into consideration the sustainability data, not just financial data. Thank you, Pernilla.
Of sustainability data, which is brought together by the managers, is put in by the manager and passed on to institutional investors to allow them to better allocate
There's an
capital,
echo because
taking into consideration the sustainability data, not just financial data.
Thank you, Pernilla.
Of sustainability data, which is brought together by the managers, is put in by the manager and passed on to institutional investors to allow them to better allocate capital, taking into consideration the sustainability data, not just financial data. Thank you, Pernilla. Sustainability data, which is brought together by the managers, is put in by the manager and passed on to institutional investors to allow them to better allocate capital, taking into consideration the sustainability data, not just financial data.
Hi, everyone. We have been testing from early this morning, and just as Murphy's laws would predict, we're having a few audio problems. Please bear with us. We'll be back in only a short while, and apologies in advance for this, but we shall return. And we're back, and thank you so much for your patience. And I can easily say that it has been like a rowdy crowd in here, although virtually our wonderful panelists took it with a smile and used the break to get even more acquainted, so that was lovely. For those of you who patiently waited for the introduction, which had apparently a very bad audio, of course we will be fair and do it again. So Emma, apologies, but now we have a very good audio, so please, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the debate. Thank you for participating, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, and yeah, apologies for the sound, but hopefully now is all good. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Really excited to hear what we've all got to say and talk amongst ourselves. My background is in environmental science, so I work at Arup at the moment, leading our sustainable development offering from the Scandinavia region. Arup is a firm made up of 14,000 staff approximately globally, and we work on many different projects across the built environment and infrastructure. And we are made up of engineers, architects, consultants like myself, and many others, as I say, globally. Thanks.
Thank you so very, very much. And Josine, on to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Pernilla. My name is Josine Peek, and I'm head of Europe, Middle East, and Africa for GRESB. And GRESB is a sustainability benchmark for real assets, real estate and infrastructure. We have currently over 5 trillion of assets coming together, sustainability data on them. And this data gets together, we validate it, we peer benchmark it, and we pass it on to the institutional investors to help them navigate this changing environment with good sustainability data, which is a necessary element in this process.
Thank you so much, and also thank you for taking time out to participate today, Josine. And Tone, you're joining us from New York, and you've been up very early to help us today. So I'm very happy to introduce you and let you welcome yourself to the audience, our viewers.
Thank you so much, Pernille. And that is true. This morning from New York City, my name is Tone Søndergaard, and I'm the director of the Danish Cleantech Hub here in New York. The Danish Cleantech Hub is a strategic partnership between the Confederation of Danish Industry and State of Green, both organizations from back in Denmark. Our aim and goal here in New York is to bridge and knowledge share with the Europeans and Americans, and hopefully create some interesting solutions and showcase what is going on in Europe and how it's relevant also to the American audience. Me personally, I've been working with this company for the last 6 years, and within the circular economy, it's really a topic that we have been taking on a lot within the last 3 or 4 years approximately. One of our major ways of doing that is by hosting the biggest circular economy festival in the US called Circular City Week New York. So that's very much one of the vehicles we use to drive this knowledge sharing on circular economy and also within the built environment. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. Now we take it to the gentleman. Bas, a huge welcome to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Pernille. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bas van der Westerlo, checking in from the Netherlands today. I'm a project manager at Ctc Expo Lab for circular construction and circular procurement, having a background in architecture, building and planning, focusing on mainly circular procurement and circular construction, as explained. Just had the opportunity to do the science talk before this debate on a great project we did before on, for example, the City Hall project in Venlo, south of the Netherlands. We are non-profit organizations and not only working on pragmatic implementation of circular economy, but also investing in new research questions to answer the circular questions for tomorrow. So thank you, Pernille. Back to you.
Thank you very, very much. And Jesper, also a huge thank you for you for participating today. And again, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jasper Miner. I'm from Miner Change Group, founder of Miner Change Group. We are a business development company. And in 2011, we started working with circular economy together with Central Denmark region, and have since been working with circular economy and a lot of different businesses within different sectors. The last couple of years, we have developed some projects on our own. So we have companies within water treatment and also within furnitures and so on, paint development and so on. So we have invested in different sectors. In the construction sector, we have been part of regional projects. We have been working with concrete. We have been working with development of new mortars so we can separate the bricks from each other. Upcycling of wood, a lot of different projects. And so I have quite some experience within the construction sector, even though we have a broader view on the circular economy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Last but absolutely not least, Kåre, I'll pass the word to you.
Thank you, Pernille, and good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Kåre Poulsgaard. I'm head of innovation for 3XN Architects and GXN Innovation. We are an architects and research company, or rather two companies, but working together very closely and sharing the same office. Our head office is here in Copenhagen. We've got offices in Stockholm, Sydney, New York, and in London. And we've been working with the circular economy in design and construction for the better part of 10 years. So both doing research work, figuring out what is the circular economy, how can we do this technically, but also increasingly realizing circular design and construction projects across the world.
Thank you so very much. And as you, the viewers, would already have ascertained, we have a diverse and extremely qualified group of panelists to embark on today's journey of the debate. And Tone, when I spoke to you earlier this week, I said, oh, didn't the earth just sigh with relief a few weeks ago when we were told that the president-elect is Joe Biden? There is hope for the green transition.
That's very true, Pernille. Definitely, I think everyone over here have been walking around a little bit anxious for the last couple of months, waiting to see how this election went. And as you all know, of course, it turned out for a Democratic victory. And I don't think it's any secret that in cities like New York, where I am, and many other of the larger cities over here, it really was a sigh of relief. I could report from streets of people really sort of being joyful, and I don't think that many champagne bottles have never been left in the streets of New York before. So it definitely was sort of a big relief and a sign of a different future. I think in terms of what we're talking about today, there is hope, at least, that a new president will also mean that the US will be rejoining, hopefully, the Paris Agreement, and President-elect Joe Biden has also been out saying that he will lean heavily on mayors all over the US to create more progressive policies also on local levels. Because, of course, as everyone is aware, it isn't only the White House that decides what the energy use looks like in the US or how we build the buildings over here. It is very much also a state and local responsibility. So that's very exciting. So hopefully good news sign of relief.
Absolutely. We have hopes that the next frontier of green solution is now, and have you also seen that from the investment perspective, Josine? Have you also felt that sigh of relief?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We keep on in the investment world, we keep on calling it, this is the inflection year. 2020 has been such an important year from so many perspectives, and also political indeed. But on the investment side, it's the inflection year. So for GRES was started 10 years ago. So for 10 years, the more forward-looking institutional investors have been gathering sustainability data 2020 is really the moment that they have been that large pension funds and large insurance companies have come to the conclusion that we have collective problems, and we will only be able to solve these problems in a collective way. So there's a real moment of realization that the old paradigm, for all its worth, and it has done a lot of good also, but it is not up to standards for these new climate change problems, social problems. This one world approach to problems. So there's definitely a clear, not a sigh of relief in a way. There's much more a re-energizing of these institutional investors. I like to compare them a bit to sleeping giants, which are waking up to their power and their ability to allocate capital in a good way.
I like that metaphor. And I know that when we also talk together, one of the things that we actually really quickly agreed on is that it is also a sigh of relief that we no longer have to discuss the why, whether this is actually critical. But we can take it to the level of the hows and the whats. And I think this is also where you guys come in and play such a wonderful role, because you have so much experience in the hows and the whats. And I know when I interviewed you, Kåre, prior to the debate, you actually said, well, listen, there is a myriad of experience that we are already working from. So there is a nuance in the hows and the whats.
Yeah, although I would add very humbly that, there is indeed the sustainability is not yet circularity. So we look at greenhouse gas emissions, and we look at water usage and waste, and and health and well-being and tenant engagement and all these things. But those are, I would say, still quite. It's a good ground to start on. But I'm here, part of this group as well, to learn from what kind of metrics would be important to start measuring and then start competing on and start improving on in this to really move these trillions of assets towards circularity.
And that is a perfect lead to you, Kåre, in terms of providing Josine with some of that input to the metric.
Sure, I mean, very happy to do so, and happy to be engaging in this discussion. I kind of like this notion of 2020 being an inflection point. I think we are seeing from our side, which is very much on the industry side, quite a lot more attention around the circular economy, and that sort of link between circular economy and sustainability metrics and value metrics is really where we are at the moment. This is where the work needs to be done. So if we talk about the hows and the whats, I think for our perspective, developing circular economy in the built environment has really been a series of developments that are all important. So the first one was developing the conceptual framework. So what are we actually talking about when we talk about circular economy in the built environment? And we published a book some time ago where we looked into this, and we decided to say, we have these 3 focus areas. We want to look at the business case. We want to look at how to design for disassembly so we can take components apart and reuse them. And we want to look at material tracking or material passporting. So there's a conceptual development there. And of course, we can always become better. We can become better at standardizing and really making sure that we're talking about the same things when we're talking about this. I know Bas probably has some good points there as well. But from there, then, we have been developing technical solutions, and we are now demonstrating that these solutions work. And I think what we're getting to now is that we know what we're talking about. We know more or less how to do this. And we also know that there are very, very good engineers and designers out there that can help us meet this and further develop the technical solution. So what we need to talk about now is really what value does this bring? What value does it bring for the environment? What value does it bring for the people that are using the buildings? But also, what value does this bring for the decision makers? So the investors and the developers that are looking for ways to create buildings and find value within the circular economy while also doing good for the environment. And that's where we're really focusing now, and where there's a lot of interesting stuff happening.
Yeah, and you've actually identified some various aspects of the value propositions. Could I ask you to elaborate a little bit on those value propositions, Kåre?
Sure, and I mean, I don't believe this is an exhaustive list, and I'd be very happy to hear from everybody else in the panel about this, but we have sort of three value propositions that we're looking at the moment. One is reducing project costs, and I can explain a little bit about that in a second. Another one is increasing material value, so making sure we get the most out of the materials we're using. And the final one that we're really looking into is reducing portfolio risks for developers or building owners. So if we think about reducing project costs, the circular economy is, if not collaborative by definition, then at least in the built environment, intensely collaborative. We are all designers, developers, engineers, producers holding a piece of the puzzle, and we need to be able to put that puzzle together through these collaborative projects. If we find better frameworks for collaborating, we really believe we can create simpler building systems. We think we can create better processes, reduce transaction costs, and thereby bring down the costs of a project. And so, as an example, we are part of a larger project here in Denmark called the Circle House. This project looks to build 60 social housing units with Housing Association Lejrbo as client. It's funded by the Danish EPA and Realdania. But the core idea with this project is to demonstrate that we can do this. And to do so, we brought 35 partners from across the building value chain together and sought to develop the products that were already out there into a more circular manner. And so one of the things that happened here is we were looking at design for disassembly at a superstructure level, so at concrete components and elements. And through that process, we simplified the superstructure of these houses immensely, so that now we actually have just three core elements. We have these floor slabs, we have beams, and we have walls. So then we are creating these in ways that they're actually put together mechanically, so you can take them apart again. And we build a demonstrator here to show the industry that this is possible. And what we found when we put the demonstrator up was, because we had a simplified system with mechanical joints, we actually had to spend 10% less time than we expected on erecting this demonstrator. And so here we are looking at reduced time on site, and I believe this is something that developers should be quite excited about. We'll see once we go up to scale if this still holds, but there is something about reducing costs there. If I can just quickly spend some time on the two others. If we talk about increasing material value, this is the idea that as we know, that the built environment generates a lot of waste, and that waste is crushed down usually. So concrete is not used at an element level; it's crushed and used for road fill, and it doesn't retain the value it has. There's different ways of preparing for that, but we have a very interesting case for this residual value in a project called the Kåre Tower in Sydney. So this is a large tower that 3XN are designing, and one of the things they were looking at was looking at the existing tower on the side there, and are basically upcycling a large part of that tower and using that as the core for the new tower. And that means that we can actually use 50% less materials for the new project. It also means that there's, again, a lot less time on site, both for demolition and construction, and we're actually saving the client, by their own estimate, 500 million kroner, so nothing, a pretty big chunk. That's about 80, I believe, million euro. And we're also saving 7,500 tons of CO2 and embodied carbon by not having to create all these new materials. So there's really a lot of impact to be had if we start thinking about how we can increase the material value. And finally, on the portfolio risks, this is the idea that we can create a more adaptable and flexible built environment, something that can adapt to new uses, something that is more transparent if we use material passporting. And we're working with a client in a project, in a tower project right now, who has this very interesting approach to this. And they're basically saying the best way to future-proof this product is to minimize the environmental footprint and build in adaptability and transparency. So make sure that we know what we have in the building. We are optimized for carbon, operational and embodied. And thereby, actually, they believe that they are able to meet market demands in the 6 years it takes to build this, but also potentially have a portfolio, if they keep reproducing this across the portfolio, that is able to withstand forthcoming legislation around carbon, for example. So these are three key value propositions that we're working with. So reducing costs for projects, increasing material value, and reducing risks for building owners.
Excellent. And Emma, you have a comment to this?
I do, yeah. Really, really interesting to hear those sort of three different angles. I was just wondering, sort of tying it with what Josephine was saying about sort of investment. How early do you think the engagement needs to come from a client perspective in those cases? Because obviously, with the first example, efficiencies, you need the supply chain to be able to respond and deliver, and then particularly in the sort of the latter points, it's obviously really important that the client is, the end client is sort of involved throughout the process. So just wondering how that works.
I believe, a large part of a project is set in those early stages when the client determines the business case, the investment horizons, the risk appetites, all these kind of things, and these are times when we traditionally are not necessarily involved as architects, and I think that's coming back to the inflection point is I think we as architects and consultants need to start thinking a little bit more about what we're doing and how we can talk about the value for clients, so that they can so it works within the models that they're working with, and also very much thinking about these time horizons. I think they're super important. Residual value is an interesting value proposition, but 60 years is a long time for a developer, or whatever, if you're building is only around 40 years, that's still too long for some. So thinking about how to communicate the value of this in ways that allows developers to build the case around it, and also thinking about how we can create value in both the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah, because I think it's also really interesting from that perspective of that with circular economy, things aren't necessarily, the value isn't realized in the first cycle or the first loop. It's quite often the second cycle, or if the products are reused in the next sort of phase of their life. So from a building perspective, maybe as engineers and consultants, trying to challenge the client, but it's also, I think, quite difficult to, as you say, communicate the value at that point of, the initial phases. So I think it's interesting to hear also from a context of an investor perspective that they're actually starting to think more along those lines. So it does make it easier, but absolutely, our job isn't over. We've still got to keep pushing our clients to start looking at those different time horizons and different frameworks.
No, I agree with you, Emma, but I do think that traditionally we've been looking at circular economy as a material economy and the value as material value, but I think what we can also start seeing is that there are other ways of generating value with the circular economy. So for example, by having these better collaborative frameworks which can actually reduce costs in the here and now, so actually capex, which I know is incredibly important for building projects. So it's also about thinking about value at different timescales and in different ways to be able to move forward.
So to just understand what you're saying, Kåre, is also that we still have a language to develop in terms of what kind of value and when during the process we're talking
Sure.
about.
I mean, how do we realize value, and in what time frames do we realize the value on? I mean, some investors, institutional investors, and I'm sure Josephine could tell us about this, they can afford to take that very long-term perspective and think about their portfolio, think about residual value, but that's not everybody, and that's not necessarily how a building case is put together. And so I think we need to develop different types of value propositions to different types of investors and developers, and be able to be quite clear about that. So it really makes sense from where the decision makers are sitting as well.
And I'll ask you just to comment on that in a second, Josephine, but just to give Bas an opportunity, because you've actually just presented a really good business case and have also identified some value propositions. So I thought I'd give you a chance to comment on Kåre's value propositions and reflections, and then Jesper would also like to comment afterwards.
Yes, well, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree what's already been said on the value propositions, and I also agree on when I look back for now over 12 years. I think the first 10 or 11 years was especially about the why. Why should we all do this? Why do we have to make this transition towards a circular economy? And we know that these types of paradigm shifts need a lot of time to make that transition happen. So maybe 10, 20, maybe even more years to make that wheel shifts take place. But I totally agree on these value proposition, and especially the residual value. I think there is a huge potential on having residual value within the business case of a circular economy. Indeed, I just showed of some examples that there is a business case on circular economy, that you can save and earn money on doing the right things for your clients, not only on energy and water, but also the materials can take place in that whole shift. Of course, and that's what Carl already been said, for example, for furniture, it is quite easy to make that transition and have residual value be placed in that loop. But also, for example, for dividing walls, facades, and even other building aspects, residual value can be very interesting to have a look at. Maybe one value proposition that I want to add here is also the aspect of health. Because I think circular economy indeed is the perception most of the time is based on materials. I think we all agree that it is much wider than only that. But I think that apart from having the shift towards a circular economy materials, that also, even in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that it is really important to having a healthy building as well. We're working from home, we're working from normally in offices that are not designed to have a healthy working place or place to live in or have education or something else like that. So I think it becomes more and more important to take that in consideration as well. And we see that the effect of that, having non-toxic materials, which is one key enabler on that as well, but also having natural airflows, healthy indoor climate, will have an effect on you and me. I think we all understand that and feel that in everywhere in our body. But we have to incorporate that as well in the value proposition and the business case we show to our clients. And maybe in the first run we have to prove that on the things we can really calculate, because that's, and Yazid maybe can add on that, but that's where the decision making is made. But please take in mind that there is more than only the numbers on economics, that we have also other value propositions that are very, very important to make this transition.
And Jesper, I had a follow-up to Bess, but Jesper, I promise that when you raise your hand, I will give you the chance to comment, so I'll give the word to you.
Thank you. I totally agree also with Bas that I think that it will be the next level of circularity, the health and so on. On course, I like the idea of the process, that we have to maybe focus more on the process to get this really running. So how can we support the process and make it more efficient? Because I think right there we have reduction in cost. We have the possibility to really set off and make this implement the circular economy worldwide. So how, Emma and Kåre, do you think, how can we support the process and make it more efficiently the process? We can talk about prefabrication and all that, but how can we take this process to the next level? Because when we look at Europe, the productivity is so low. So there's no, it's a sector that it's conservative and it's really not moving fast. So how are we going to change this? That I think the potential is huge. How are we going to implement it? That's maybe you could give a comment on that, because what we see also on the product level, the circularity, the cost of the products, it will be a bit higher, often because it's not industrialized yet. So if we look at the process, I think there could be a really option to kick off this circular economy. So yeah.
Before you comment, just in terms of the process and time as a value proposition, because Bess, when you presented at our Science Talks just an hour ago, you actually also pointed out that one of the aspects of the success of Venlo City Hall was that every actor part of the construction process were collaborating on this for 2.5 years prior to the building commencing. So maybe you can also just add to that in terms of Kåre's point of value propositioning, and then a quick comment to Jesper's.
Yeah, I agree, and it is something which not happen overnight. I think we all agree on that. So what I think is very important here as well is that we incorporate also the supply chain, the companies we work with, on a very early stage. And I think that I think it's already mentioned, but also circular procurement is one big enabler on that. But when you are around the table as a design team or construction team, I think it's very important to have these supply chain members around the table as well on a short notice, so that you give them the time to have innovative solutions and to develop them as well. City Hall, as an example, took place for design phase for 2 years, 2.5. So when we invited them in the first weeks and months, they had still 2 years for innovation time, which is free to them. And we promised them, if you are there where we want you to have, we will incorporate you in the project. And I think that's really, really important to have subjects like residual value, like material passporting, like health as part of the discussion and on the agenda. And what I'm really happy with is that a project like this, like City Hall, is a big catalyst, an enabler for new projects that wants to be or even better, or try to kind of copy paste what they have seen and incorporate it in their development. So there is a movement going on that you want to see here.
And Kåre and Emma, would you like to comment on Jesper's question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to jump in, Kåre. But just reflecting actually also on what Baz just said as well, I think one of the key things that we need to do is, and to support, I think, is partnerships across all sorts of different levels. So I think there's, Kåre, as you mentioned, the sort of decision makers, but they are also at policy level. And then how can that enable through on, a manufacturing level, so down through into the supply chain? Because I think there is also quite a significant challenge in the introduction of new policies, which obviously we need to have in place, but I think there's quite often a pushback, and a lot of organizations decide or feel less inclined to do something unless the policy's there. So how do we use that as an enabler rather than as a barrier to stopping to do things? And I think working closely with manufacturers and those organizations that are designing and creating new products that are circular, or perhaps new business models around circular products. So, products as a service type approaches, but making them accessible for then the clients that are making the decisions, because at the moment there is quite a gap, I would say, in terms of the accessibility to both the types of materials, but also the cost. And that's something that then, when you come down to a decision on a project level, to suggest or propose certain material choices, it quite often gets value engineered out because of costs, which I think the value proposition, Kåre, that you were making as well, we need to communicate that better as well. So I think from our perspective, it's certainly supporting through partnerships, but across a multitude of different levels and engagement points, I think.
I agree with that, and it is a good question from Jesper, and unfortunately not one we have a quick fix for. But I do think there's a couple of points here. Like, one is the value of demonstrator projects. Bas was just talking about the project in the Netherlands that he was presenting before. We have the Circle House here, and these projects can work because there's the external funding, either governments or others that are putting in for that. So in these demonstrators, we do get to find new ways of working together and demonstrate the value. I think that's the first step. But I also do think, and this is the inflection point again, that we've gotten to the point where we actually know what works and what doesn't. Of course, there's still issues, and of course, things would be value engineered out. But I think it's a question of finding the ambitious developers and the project teams that can actually deliver, and then work with them. And we're seeing that commercially in a few of our projects at the moment. So it's also a question for the industry now to step up and really try and we need some leadership from the people who can actually do this to show the way forward, document the value, and then I think once we have enough projects documenting that, that's gonna go further into the industry. And of course, I mean, we can also, what are the parameters we're going for? It shouldn't just be money, of course. Carbon is an interesting thing, and that's where we start talking about policies. I mean, we can change the framework of what's important in projects. If offset costs become high, there's a whole different incentive to start looking at embodied carbon and ways of bringing that down. So obviously there's quite a few approaches, but I think we shouldn't be too wary right now of saying that we actually kind of know a lot of this already, and it's about finding now the commercial partners that are willing to take leadership and show the way forward here.
I totally agree on us.
Before I give the word to Josine.
Yes, one comment or what I would like to add, and I totally agree what's been said here, and I think progress over perfection maybe. Because I know some work from Arab, I know work from GXN, I know work from Miner Change Group, and I think something we have in common here is that we are doing it, and that we try to make things happen and make step forward. And I think we all can agree that it's not 100% perfect, of course, but we're making the step into the direction and make it transparent. Let's show what the values are and try to raise that bar all over again in the new projects. And indeed, we need leadership. We need the examples to move this forward. But please start doing it and don't wait until the moment we are there on 100% level, because then we lose a lot of time.
Just reflecting on that, I completely agree. And also from a policy perspective, I think that's sometimes where we have such an issue, is that it needs to be perfect for policy. And it's not the case in the real world. You know, we need that flexibility from a policy perspective to enable, like you say, things to actually be delivered on site and, you know, use different types of materials. It doesn't always fit into a very formatted policy landscape. So there needs to be a bit of almost grey areas, but at the moment it's quite a traditional process from a policy perspective. So I think that's why things take so long, and it's quite an archaic system in terms of developing those policies. And I hope, you know, I still think, and based on, I think, as what you were saying as well, that, you know, if we push as industry and, you know, consultants and deliver these projects, we can almost prove that we're going over and above the policy already, that, you know, this works. You know, you can write the policy afterwards, but we need to just get out and practice and do that. Yeah.
And are the investors responding to the fact that we have companies that are ahead of the policymaker, Josine? Are they responding because you already presented and argued the case that the pension funds are ready to make those long-term investments because they know the need is there?
Yeah, I'd like to give a bit of, how do you say, again, a metaphor, if I may. So institutional investors, and actually Bas also made the point, my world is very much a world that focuses and hones in on certain metrics. That's how we've been trained. And to be clear, for the last 100 years, so that's not nothing, we've basically honed in on one variable, which is money. You know, this is millions of people coming together and optimizing on one variable. And I like to compare that to like a big column, you know. It's a mechanistic type of reductionist worldview, I would argue, and it worked really well. But now we see all these variables. We start with the more easy variables, which is, you know, operational carbon. That looks just like money. Instead of maximizing, you need to minimize. So that's something we can grasp quite easily. But already embedded carbon is a lot more difficult to calculate. And then we have the much more human-centric variables, which, to be honest, we don't even have yet. So we're still struggling to get metrics for, you know, how people feel, social, etc. So where this column built in 100 years, I would argue, is very mechanistic and is based on Excel spreadsheets, this other environment, this non-financial data environment, is much more an organic setup of a lot of people coming together collaboratively, bringing data together, and then hopefully optimizing on certain metrics together. So it's truly a different for these institutional investors, it's truly a different ball game. And we're I would say at the very start of this new world perspective of bringing data together and collaborating in a different way together in this financial world.
Yes, exactly. And as you said when we talked, Josine, good data or good decisions are based on good data, and good data requires that we actually know the variables in order to compile the data. And I think some of the things that you've all touched upon now is that we are acquiring so much experience and knowledge that we're beginning to be able to identify the variables. I have a question to you, Josine, from the audience and or from the viewers, and thank you very much. We have from Line Gry Knudsen to Josine, collaboratively, you mentioned in your introduction in terms of the value of collaborative, and Line is asking you to elaborate, because we know that that is core to ensuring circular economic solutions. So could you elaborate in terms of how you ensure the collaborations?
Yeah, sure. And I will also just, we do use the current hierarchy that is the hierarchy prevalent in this market. So we put we are firmly hierarchical in the sense that we say the institutional investors are the guys, the information takers, and they tell us the variables that they find important. And then we let the managers report on those variables. So both, we have an investor board where all the investors come, or a group of investors come together to help us navigate which items, which variables to ask, and then the managers help us tinker that out. So it's truly set up collaboratively, but with that hierarchy that the institutional investors call the shots.
Yeah. And one of the things you also mentioned to me, which ties in with what Emma was talking about in terms of partnerships, is the element of trust. That the good relationship between manager and investor, there is that level of transparency that Bas has mentioned, and trust. And we know that in other pieces of research that the strategic partnerships are based on trust, and what we got from Bas's lecture from the science talks was also in terms of that collaboration across disciplines. And from the viewer, Grave Simonsen, thank you for this good question to you, Bas. It's very interesting what you said, Bas, about including the suppliers in the early phase. What are the experiences, the Dutch experiences regarding public clients and the tender regulation? It is a subject matter we'll return to, but I'd like you to share the experiences now before we go on to the next topic.
Yeah, I think a very good question from the audience, and I think we will talk about that later on as well. But public procurement, green public procurement, is, I think, really a big enabler for every assignment within the public sector to make the shift towards circular economy. And there is already a lot of knowledge about that, how to ask the question, and often, and I think I'm talking here about experiences here over the last couple of years, but the people working on tendering, so the procurement guys and are not the specialists in circular economy yet. They are especially focusing on guiding the process, right? Talking about the managers of the projects, they are mainly focusing on the budget, the planning, and the demands that they have from their organizations. So we need the gap between these two to incorporate circular economy within that field. And I really believe, and I think all the projects until today never were more expensive or took more time or were less quality at the end of the project, where circular economy was part of that decision-making process. So we have to make it part of that process in both objective way, so that you can really compare the bidders from the very first moment, but also incorporate the subjective part of that, because I don't want only to see the best plan, the best bid. I only want to select the best partner, because we already agreed on that we have to do this together for a longer time. And it's not just one moment in time where we select the best option, the best design out of, I don't know, 10 or even more. but we have to do this together. And that's why we have to select the right partner as well to do that. And well, honestly, there is more than enough knowledge to do that. We can start it right away, but we have to feel the right moments, the right clients, the right partners to do that together. And I can remember less than a year ago, together with GXN and also Miner Change Group around the Circle House project, Kåre, you already mentioned it, we had some brainstorm sessions around that, just to make an ambition, a vision, to make that also practical into awarding criteria and demands. And I'm really looking forward to do that in more and more of these type of projects. I think the time is there for doing that.
Thank you. And Emma, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I did. Just from a context, and maybe we'll touch on sort of procurement slightly later, but I just think also it's interesting from an infrastructure perspective. So obviously still built environment, but not buildings. And of course, the development time for infrastructure is so extensive. It's such a long lead-in time that what we can sometimes see is that circular economy strategies are designed and built, written at an early stage, and then when it comes to that procurement process, it's the market's not there. There's no access to the kind of ambitions that are outlined in the strategies themselves. So I think, just sort of reflecting on your point, Baz, I think market dialogue is really important in both the strategy level, but of course also that procurement level. And I think that's perhaps a way to at least mobilize on that sort of disconnect between procurement perhaps not having that understanding yet of circular economy, and how do we bring them into the conversations at an early stage, but also in terms of creating the strategies themselves, because obviously you need to have, there's a competition element, of course, in procurement, and with big infrastructure projects as well, that's even more apparent. So I think that's where market dialogue and speaking at an early stage could be quite beneficial in sort of hearing what's available and what might be available in 10 years time, or when the project actually gets to procurement phase, and how can those particular organizations be involved in the project at an early phase as well. So I think it's an interesting sort of point, but I think market dialogue could be a way forward as well.
I think the concept that you're talking about, the market dialogue, is quite interesting, because when I spoke to Tone earlier this week, Tone was also saying that when we're dealing with these circular solutions and on the journey towards an encompassing and scalable circular solution, Tone, you basically said we need it's not only the paradigm shift in terms of grasping that sustainability is a variable, as Josine has said. The old model was great in so many ways. It was linear, and we had a price as a denominator, and that was good. But now there are other variables that we have to bring into the equation. And based on that, what you were also highlighting, and I thought it was such a lovely way of expressing it, that we have to move from the trade fair of demonstrating one gadget to a systemic export of showing the solutions. And following up on you, Emma, when you talk about the market dialogue and in changing, and we also spoke earlier in terms of the agility that we need in policy making, I'd like just for you to elaborate a little bit, Tone, on what is it that you're envisioning when you're saying we need to have the systemic export in play?
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely right, Pernille, and it's really interesting hearing you guys essentially making it much more easy for me sitting here on the other side of the pond, because essentially what we of course are seeing over here is that the more mature these conversations is getting back in Europe, the more we get the value proposition down and so on, the more attractive it becomes, of course, also in an American setting to bring these solutions over. I'm like Kåre, I'm a big advocate for this idea of pilot testing, and I think that is in many ways also where the Americans maybe are in some sense. Now that we do have the business case down, it's time to now also on this side of the pond sort of showcasing how to do it. And that's what you're hinting to, Pernille, is essentially we have learned from doing this in many different industries over decades. A good example right now here in the US is, of course, taking the entire offshore wind industry from Europe and sort of transferring it into an American setting. And it isn't just like, you can't just do that, right? You have to create the local ecosystems essentially around these new industries. And especially within circular economy, I think it's super important because all the solutions you talk about often have a very localized element, whether that's figuring out then where does this residual value actually fit into this new and different sort of ecosystem that we have. And also sort of touching a little bit on what Emma said and Josine for that sake, I think what we see over here is that we need to start building these projects and so on in order to even explore and figure out what are the policies that needs to be changed. Because before we sort of get to the point of testing it out, we don't even know, we can't even sort of figure that out. And we don't know what the investors will be asking for unless we start doing it. So this sort of idea of ecosystem development is really something that we are sort of big proponents of and really try and work on and figure out how to do that.
Excellent, because I know you, Jesper. Sorry, I'll get back to you, Emma. I know you, Jesper. You also have an almost, I would say, passionate, and it is the right word, very passionate opinion in terms of how we need to focus on procurement, how we need to focus on policy making, also as we're developing the business models. And I'd like you to follow up a little bit on the various things that have been said at the moment to basically address that the dialogue between the various business models that you guys are currently developing, as well as the need for agility with the policymakers in order to have the flexible procurement process.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So mostly we are working with within the construction sector. It's low-tech companies, and many of the companies in that sector is low-tech. It means concrete, it's wood, it's but there's also high-tech, of course, in that sector. Some of those companies within this sector, low-tech companies, also paint development and so on, I think they're having a hard time to get through this period. I think it's because the linear system is so good, and to develop a new product that can compete with a very structured process, that's a challenge, I think. So we often see, and those projects I have been part in, we see that it will be in the beginning for those companies. I think it will be a bit more expensive before we industrialize the circular process. So we have to get really volume into this process. We're talking tons and we're systematic processes and so on that needs to be implemented in that sector before we can see reduction in costs on the product level. And I agree on Kåre on the process that I think there can be a really good road in that way. I think on the procurement side, we have had projects and products where we go to municipalities and try to offer them, and what they look at is the price. So we have a circular product, we offer them, see, here's a circular product, we have take back, we have residual value, we have everything in place. And what will they will choose a product produced far away and with cheap labor and of course no sustainability. So there is, for some companies in this sector, a really hard time, and we need also to find structures to support those companies in that transition in this. And I think the procurement tool, and Bas, you can talk about that as well. I think that could be one of them, but also legislation on these things. Should companies have a take-back system? And because I find if we need to implement this take-back system, and also, Bas, you can comment on that, we need the residual value implemented. We need to put value into those products and when they go to market, it's the company that have the responsibility to take it back and reuse it. So the design have to be in place. And in that transition, we need help, I think, from the government side. And now I've been working also with the building suppliers and all that, and I can again just tell from a negative perspective, we need some help to do the transformation to really work this out, because everything is about cost. Everything it is. We see, of course, I see upcoming ideas. We need to do this. We need to move forward. But in the end, this is about cost, and I think that really needs a motor to move that process forward, because we need the low-tech companies to move ahead also in this process. I can talk about the high-tech companies later. It's more easy maybe, but in that sector, that needs help.
Now we have Emma, Kåre, Bas on the list, and I will let Emma go first.
So my point was a little bit back towards what Tone was saying, from a sort of well, it's linked in a way to what you're saying, Jesper, around that procurement and government level. But I was just wondering, Tone, on sort of that city scale engagement perspective, what have you seen in terms of engagement from mayors and local mayors? And I think it's something we've seen from more of a climate agenda, particularly in Arup as being a knowledge partner to the C40 network, so supporting on climate action plans for cities. And I was just wondering how we kind of bridge that and support that, and sort of demonstrate that circular economy can also be a part of those action plans, and whether there's something or an appetite in the States for that.
No, absolutely. It's actually been really interesting. I, over the last year or so, participated in this working group together with the City of New York, where we were trying essentially to create the value case for why is it that a large city like New York, or even smaller cities, of course, should engage in these topics. And it's been interesting to see that, of course, the American agenda, and especially these days, it is so dependent on job creation. So maybe it's one of the things that we haven't talked so much about in Europe, essentially, is that when the Americans talk about the value of circular economy from a mayoral perspective, it's often about high quality jobs, and the idea of being able to create localized supply chains around circularity that are really attractive to them, and are really attractive to the people who are essentially going to vote for them, hopefully down the line. So that's one of the things that I think is quite different. But absolutely lots of interest, also from the climate perspective. But this build back greener, this building back how to recover in the US is enormously important. The other thing that we also looked a lot on in that, which is also in some cases a little bit more American, is the idea of how circular economy can be a driver of just and more equal society. So, when we talked a lot about what do we do with building stock and so on, it was often a matter of how can we share the assets better? How can circular economy and these ideas be part of enabling also low-income communities to access the buildings or use those assets and so on. So that's really interesting, and some of the things that we see that at least I experienced that are different, and what really gets mayors and cities over here excited about this agenda.
That's really interesting. Also, sorry, I was just going to just finish on that. The EU Green Deal obviously is reflecting quite a lot around that job creation and just transition. So I think that's interesting that is maybe not translating directly, but that's an angle that gains traction. It's good.
Kåre? You're muted.
There we are. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
No, I just wanted to pick up on Jesper's point about cost. It's certainly true, and that was also Josian's point earlier. We have a system that's been super optimizing itself over the last 100 years for at least one parameter, and that's cost. That means that if you're gonna go into that market and try and come in, you are on a very sort of unequal playing field. cost of your product could be one thing. I think figuring out other ways of talking about price and costs is one way to shift that. I mean, the other thing is to shift the overall perspective, which is what I got a little bit from Josine and what Tone was also just saying about. We don't have to just compete on cost. We have learned here in Denmark, and I'm sure in other places in Europe and probably also in the States, to compete on energy. So, you know, we used to compete on price per square meter. Now we compete on price per square meter and kilowatt hours per square meter, basically. And increasingly, we could be competing on carbon per square meter. And so I would be wanting to maybe push Josine a little bit more to hear about that process from where you're sitting of actually not just changing, but changing the paradigm. You know, what is it actually for the parameters that we're going with, and how can we take that sort of discussion that you're having and actually really push that into the built environment better?
Yeah, a big ask there, but thank you. Now, I mean, with a paradigm shift, you can't do this. You have to trust that it's happening, right? That's the first thing I would like to say. But you can really see, I'm seeing it all the time, but I might be sort of lopsided in my view, that is happening. And one thing I find very interesting is what you've seen. So we went from that I would call it mono variable approach of the historical paradigm to this idea, oh gosh, there might be some more variables that we need to figure in. And that process is quite an interesting one because, it started with carbon, like we said, but what we're seeing right now, and I think that's where we are in this point, we're seeing that where the investor community is realizing that everything they do has both positive and negative impacts. And, you know, carbon is a clear example of a negative impact, but of course, especially on infrastructure, you know, sometimes you need to put a metro line in place because it's actually a very positive impact as well. So, and the most advanced investors out there are actually starting to get a grapple with every investment decision comes a whole suite of positive and negative impacts. And, you know, getting that data in, getting that and navigating that type of environment in a good way together. I mean, it's a huge ask, but it's something we're currently, we have technology, we're all super smart. We've been well fed and well clothed for years. So most likely the industry is really ready to do this big transition towards taking these variables in, and that's what I'm seeing happening right now. One good example of that is all these investors coming together in these big sustainable development goals type of, you know, targeted groups saying, guys, we are going to do this right now, and there is no, you know, there's in essence there's no alternative. Trump never had an alternative. He was just trying to keep something which was inevitable. He was trying to hold that back. So yeah, it's a fascinating time. Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you. If I may just pick up on
I'm just going to interrupt
there.
you, Kåre, because we also have a very active the viewers. So I knew that you would be able to discuss and debate for a long time, but we have some wonderful questions. Now, part of what you were also asked by me to think about just a little bit was in terms of what more do we need to successfully ensure the full green transition. Now, that question in mind, I'm just going to read to you some of the questions that we have received, because I think it ties in very well with the closing remarks. We have the question from a Chuck to Kåre. Do you think a common methodology of evaluating material reuse values and defining reuse strategies could scale up circular material economy? Follow-up question to that. Is certification the way forward? I'll let you contemplate, and I'll go on with the other questions. That way we can take a final round from all of you afterwards. Gravis, there is a comment on your reply to Gravis's question. And Gravis writes, and thank you, Gravis, for doing this. It's wonderful. I agree, Bess, but I think we also have to work on the system level and not only on the individual projects to make the real changes. I think this is what you've also addressed just now, but still, in fairness. And Graves continues, of course we have to focus on recreating a comparing market, but how do you view on using regulators as, i.e. taxes, to lead the market into the right direction? And I think that ties very well with Jesper's questions as well. So, and then there is one final question that is slightly out of line with this sequence of questions, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Beth said that in the Westerlo case, they couldn't reuse a lot of the materials from the old building. Do the rest of you, Emma and Kåre and Jesper, do you have reflections from the projects that you have been in on that maybe are different to that? So those are the questions that we have. So do we need certification? Do we need taxes and regulations? Is that what we need to ensure what I have labeled the highway to green heaven? And we'll, this time as the closing comments and reflections, we will again start with the ladies first. So Emma, I'll let you go first.
I've got the shortest time to think about that, but some interesting, really interesting questions. I think overall reflection, I really value the point about that systemic change and system change. So I think going across all the points raised today about the importance of collaboration and that partnership across the different levels, I think has come out really strongly. I think it's interesting that the point raised there about certification and sort of taxation and regulation. I think in some cases, I think that does work, and it has more traditionally worked from sort of sustainable buildings perspectives and looking at sort of sustainable certifications and mobilizing on that. And I also think that's a useful source of collating data and information. But how we really utilize that to create that systemic change, I think that's really crucial, kind of the next phase of certification. How do we use that in a way that demands the change on a systemic level? And I think, Josen, you've mentioned some points there about that investor, they're sort of waking up to the facts, both positive and negative. And I think that's a really interesting sort of perspective that, where do we go next, and how do we use the tools and methods that we have in place to mobilize that next phase? But I think that systemic level change is really important across, as I mentioned, sort of the different levels, from a policy landscape and through down to sort of resource use. I think that's really critical.
Thank you very much. And Josine, would you like to share your reflections?
Yeah, I'd love to add to what Emma's saying, and I so agree with that as well. I would take the angle of one of the things that makes me very optimistic is the European Commission and the way they understand this shift and change and are doing what they can. So one thing they can't do taxes, clearly. So that's off the table for the EU. But what they can do, and that's my favorite bit of legislation, which is coming up, is SFDR. And SFDR it's very like GRESB. It's obliging all these large institutional investors to start reporting on these 32 material, non-financial metrics. And what are you going to see is, and this is starting in the beginning of 2021, the 1st of January, you're going to see this data coming on board, and people again doing all the games that we're also doing. Who's better at this, who's doing that, and then so this very natural navigating of doing the right thing, which we all truly want to do, is going to happen because of transparency on these important critical metrics. So that's my word of hope. Wonderful. I hope.
Thank you very much. And Tone, on to you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, very good questions. And I think, again, me maybe sort of bringing the American side into that, procurement and taxation means to sort of create a circular economy and systemic change is not traditionally the route they've chosen over here. So in that sense, I think that's also why I talk more about the ecosystem because I think what we will see over here is sort of this bottom up or like ground up kind of effect instead, that it will come from that means. I think many of them, when I, for instance, participated in this like working group, they envy us from having a European Commission that can really set forward a path and so on, and do it in such a coordinated and systemic way. But I think the Americans knows that they have to do it essentially the opposite way around. So that's really interesting, and seeing how they're going to go about that. And that's why the job perspectives and the economics of it maybe play a bigger role over here. So yeah, super interesting. Lots of optimism, but super interesting and different ways of doing it.
And Bess, your closing reflections?
Yes, well, I think seeing the questions that we have a very good public today, asking very clever questions. Talking about the system change, yes, of course, indeed, we need to do this together to make this all happen. I think if we go into the certification, I think certification is always a mean. It is not a goal on itself. So let's make having certified materials or buildings as a proof that we are on the right way. But it's not a goal on itself of having only cradle to cradle certified or BREEAM or LEED or whatsoever certifications we have. I've once heard that we have over 450 sustainable certifications, so we can choose whatever we would like. But I think we all agree on the goal and the ambition we want to go for. One thing what makes me also positive is that becomes more and more evidence of that this is the right way doing. We see a lot of research on that, and maybe reflecting on what Jesper was saying on circular procurement. I think he was right that from a private point of view, that more than 80% of the tenders, for example, are focusing on lowest price. So I think we have to make a change there, because it is not clever doing that. And there is research which proves that having more than 30% in your tender focusing on points on price, it doesn't make sense to do it more over than 30%. So which means that 70% or even more can evaluate it on quality level. And let's make quality then reflecting on circular economy and sustainability. And I think there is a big opportunity. And what Jesper was saying here as well before is there are a lot of tools there. We ourselves made once a circular tender toolkit. So I think there is more enough information to share on this topic and to help people, guiding them in making first steps and to make this happen. So I'm always positive, but I think also what's happening around us is that there is a lot of knowledge and will to go for that.
Thank you so very much. And Jesper, your last reflections?
Yeah, I will just say that this ship will not turn around. It will keep moving forward. So that's the way. That's what we're going to see. Even though we will have some struggles and we don't have time to wait, so we have to speed up. And therefore we need some systemic changes as well. On some of the projects we're working on within the water sector, we see really good business opportunities. We can see that we can earn money. We see that we can come in with new business models, and there are many of those companies that can do that. But we, as I said, we also need to focus on other industries than those who are doing well. We need this legislation to be more clear and helpful in this transition, and not necessarily on certifications, but on documentation, that people need to document what is inside their products, and they also have to guarantee takebacks and residual values for the future. In that way, we will secure our resources in the future, and I think maybe that have to go a bit more faster than it's, so it's just my final word. So let's, make some business out there.
Thank you, Jesper. And on to you, Kåre.
Yes, I have the most time to reflect. I'm not sure my answer is going to really reflect that. But it's great audience questions as well. I think a lot of clever stuff has already been said about certification. I might just add that certification makes it easy for institutional investors, for example, to ask for something. You can say we're only doing gold certified, whatever, buildings from now on. So in that sense, certification is an important tool. I'm not sure it's enough, and I definitely would agree with Bas that certification for certification's sake is hardly interesting. The same tool sort of goes with the standards. We haven't talked much about that, but we're working with the Danish Standards Organization, which right now are starting up I believe it's a subcommittee, not a full committee, but a subcommittee to look at shared European standards for aspects of circular economy. Again, these types of standards can make it easier for a procurer to ask for circular economy. What do you actually ask for when you ask for circular building? Bas knows a lot about this, but if we could standardize that would help procurers ask for these things as well. And then I believe there's a question if we as an industry needed a shared tool to understand the impact of materials and end-of-life scenarios. It's an interesting question, and I believe if we're talking about sort of one tool to rule them all, I don't think the answer is yes. I think that building a platform for something that as complex as the built environment is going to be very tricky. But what we need is shareable data, and data that we are all sort of agreeing on the basic formats of. So we know that if we know we are comparing, and so that we know, and this goes back to Josie's point about expanding what we're looking at when we're looking at the impact of investment, both positive and negative. So we can start understanding the parameters we can evaluate from, and understanding the impacts, and generate cases and an understanding that's shared, so we know what's feasible moving forward. So maybe it's not a question of necessarily creating one tool, but it's a question of creating the data frameworks that allow us to maybe use different tools, but share the results of those tools in a meaningful way. But yeah, the ship won't turn. I agree with Jesper.
I could almost, I'm tempted to start another debate, and of course we don't have time for that. But just to pick up on what you just said in terms of that we need different sets of data. And it brings me back to a conversation I had with Josie prior to this debate. The spreadsheet is not able to fathom multiple levels, the manifold complexity of data. And this is the true testament to the paradigm shift that we are currently witnessing. But the data platform can encompass all these various types of data. The human mind is amazing, it can do so many things, but there is a level of complexity in this paradigm shift that we cannot fathom alone. So I think Josie would completely agree with you, Kåre. It's time for me to say thank you, and I want to bow a massive, deep bow of respect to you guys for what you have been able to convey in the last hour and a half. To the viewers, I thank you for your patience, because we had some audio difficulties, which has also meant that we talked a little bit more because we had to catch up with that. But I hope you found it worthwhile, the time to stay on and continue, because I think what you have addressed is exactly the complexity that Kåre also told me when I interviewed Kåre prior to today. Namely, the fascination of construction is that the process is actually repetitive. It happens over and over again. That allows us the opportunity of scalability, of standardization, and of copying what works. But in a paradigm shift, we cannot copy what we've done before. We have to go the new ways. And that is where there is a schism. That the abstract of this repetitiveness of the standardization of the process that has repeated itself for centuries. Now we have to find new ways, because we have to develop new languages. Bas has touched upon that in terms of cross-disciplinary collaboration. Josie has as well. Emma, you raised the need for strategic partnerships. And I think, Tone, you just also raised our awareness and just brought to mind that we may focus on cost, we may focus on legislation, we may focus on procurement, but there is also another, in other parts of the world, there is another sense of urgency where the argument of job creation and high-skilled job creation is really also at play. It's not time to be philosophical because we're running out of time. Yet I would say we didn't only sigh a relief a few weeks ago, but I also think that you feel in today's debate the sense of passion, the sense of urgency from the panelists. We are here. We will not turn around, as Jesper said. The ship has left the harbor, as it were. We've set sails. We are embarking on the new frontier towards the green heaven. And with that, I also know that during this debate, to you viewers, we've sent you a thank you mail for your participation. Please take a look at it because we'd love to see you again. To our amazing panelists, thank you, thank you, thank you. It is the human touch that will make us create the tomorrow that we so want to. So even though you're not with us at BLOXHUB, I felt your presence here today, and I felt your vision and your commitment and your experience and your wisdom. And I so look forward to greeting you in BLOXHUB, have you, the viewers, with us at BLOXHUB, where we can continue this debate. If you were here, we would of course continue over a glass of wine. Bear that in mind when I bid you adieu. I look forward to welcoming you again, and thank you. And have a great day wherever you are watching. Bye.